Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we celebrate Father's Day in the memory of Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman by digging into the stories of his son David and grandson Patry, each carrying on the family's legacy in their own way. In the second half of our show, Patry Friedman, founder and chairman of the Seasteading Institute, talks about his efforts to promote competitive governance. Up first, David Friedman, professor of law at Santa Clara Law School, shares some of his late father's teachings and describes their impact on his own development as a leading anarcho-capitalist scholar. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
David, your father, Milton Friedman, has been described as one of, if not the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century. He's perhaps best known by the general public for his 1980 PBS television series Free to Choose that extolled the virtues of unfettered capitalism. Your mother, Rose, was no slouch either, co-authoring several books with your dad. What was it like being raised by intellectual giants?
It seems perfectly normal to me, given that it's the way I always lived. Part of what I liked about my father was that he, in effect, treated everybody as an equal, so that I cannot ever remember being told, you're wrong because I'm the grown-up and you're the child. It was always, not that he wouldn't say I was wrong, but it was always, here are the reasons, and, I got to make my argument. Somebody I knew in college had met someone who said he met me and my father skiing, I think probably in Colorado, probably when I was in high school, and that we spent all our time arguing, and I won half the argument. And the second part is not true. My win rate was never that high.
So you argued with your dad a lot. Did you ever go out in the backyard to play catch, or was it not
we
that sort of...
We played ping pong in the basement.
Okay.
We had a ping pong table in the basement. And my father had what I still think is the right solution to the problem of grown-ups playing with kids, which is not that you pretend to be worse than you are, but you set up a sliding handicap.
Bingo.
So the way we did it was that every time he won a game, the number of points I started with went up by 1, and every time I won a game, it went down by 1. So in equilibrium, we were even at all times. And there was the further sort of metagame of my trying to push my handicap down to 0, which I eventually did.
Always the economist. Of all the ardent defenders of capitalism, your father had the most disarming and effective personal demeanor. I mean, it was impossible not to like him. In many ways, he was the polar opposite of the prickly Ayn Rand who never met someone she couldn't pick a fight with. How did he pull that off?
It's a good question. Part of it, one of the things I remember his telling me was that you don't persuade somebody with an argument. You give him ideas with which he may later persuade himself. And another way he put the point was that anybody you can persuade with one argument isn't worth persuading him because someone else will persuade him back with the next.
Oh, I like that one.
So that he didn't really see it as sort of a fight. The word argument is itself a loaded word. That my wife likes to refer to someone she read who said that a couple should never go to bed with an argument unsettled between them. And her response was that person thought argument meant quarrel. And argument to us never meant quarrel. An argument was fun. It was interesting. It was, here is a claim somebody has made. Here's why I think it's wrong. Here's why he thinks it's right. What are the reasons for either? And I'm struck interacting with people on Facebook, which is on the whole a pretty depressing activity, that most of them, at least in the groups that I've looked at, especially climate arguments, aren't really interested in the ideas at all. They're interested in cheering for their team, whichever team it is, in booing the other team, and saying how great they are. That's their idea of an argument, rather than here are reasons, here are my reasons in response. Fine, I now see why I might be wrong. I will think about that, and the same on the other side. So that was part of it. But I'm sure there were other parts as well. One thing that may have helped is that both he and I are quite short. He was about 5'3", and I think people tend to see big people as more sort of aggressive and threatening than small people. And I think that may have made it easier.
Did Milton ever make any bitter enemies?
I don't know. That is, there are clearly enemies who never met him, who you observe, online. Naomi, what's her name, for instance. On the other hand, I know that he and Galbraith were friends. And actually one, in a sense, example contrary to what I just quoted as saying about arguments is that there was a radio talk show host whose name I have forgotten, who was generally left-wing. And my father went on his show and on the air persuaded him that the airwaves ought to be auctioned off on essentially freedom of speech grounds.
Well, we'll get to that. That was a big issue of his, which eventually came through.
But what I was going to say is that I met the man later, and he clearly still had, friendly view of my father.
Wow. My one memory of your dad was at a Cato Institute conference where he was a luncheon speaker. And I remember during the Q&A, you got up to ask a question, and you prefaced it by saying, "A wise man once told me," but before you could get another word out, your dad replied, "I could never tell you anything." The audience loved it. I mean, your dad passed away at the ripe old age of 94 about 9 years ago. Was anything left unresolved between you two?
I don't think so. That is, we had disagreements as to how likely different things were, but those were the kind of disagreements where I don't think either of us thought he could prove his conclusion. Not that long before he died, maybe a couple of years before he died, I wrote my first novel, which was marketed as a fantasy, but it was really a historical novel with made-up history. And when I finished writing it, I concluded that the personality of the protagonist had been modeled on my father's.
Interesting.
It wasn't intentional.
Interesting. It came out in a Freudian way.
And his comment on reading the novel was that he was sorry to lose me to economics, which was an exaggeration. I've spent more time on economics than on writing fiction since.
But it was a nice compliment as a novelist.
Yeah, he enjoyed it. It wasn't enormously successful. But, no, on the whole, I think he was probably the wisest person I've known. At least I can't think of any other. And I don't think that there were any real disagreements beyond the level of, I think these institutions will probably work but might not, and his saying, well, I think they probably won't but might.
Many children rebel from the orthodoxy preached by their parents. You seem to do it by taking Milton's stated principles to what you call their natural conclusions. Tell us about your own intellectual journey.
Sure. I think my position, probably at about 15 or so, was roughly my father's position, which I would think of as the classical liberal position, that the appropriate role of government is police, courts, and national defense, and not much else.
And classical liberal for our younger audience, meaning libertarian.
Meaning the 19th century meaning of liberal, which is closer to libertarian than to any other current position. The classical liberalism also included some other elements, and people who call themselves libertarian nowadays, I think, tend to have a somewhat more extreme version of the position than people who called themselves liberals in the 19th century. But it's really a variant of the same.
A good overlap. And how did the path take you through a PhD in theoretical physics?
Because I didn't want to spend my life being identified primarily as my father's son.
Interesting.
And given that, physics was obviously an interesting subject. I was good at math. I went to college at 16, and the first math course I took was an advanced calculus course that was open to both undergraduates and graduate students. And it was an interesting subject, but I eventually concluded I got a PhD in physics. I did 2 years as a postdoc at Columbia, and I concluded that I was really a better economist than a physicist.
After all.
Basically, up to being a postdoc, I could take advantage of the fact that I was really better at it than most of the people around me. When my colleagues were professors of physics at Columbia, that wasn't true anymore. And if I think of it in terms of the kind of workshop where somebody is presenting a paper, if that's in physics, I'm one of the people sitting at the back trying to follow it. If that's in economics, I'm one of the people sitting in the front saying, well, look, you're wrong about this, and, why don't you look at that, and that kind of thing. So I just concluded that I had to, face the facts of where my comparative advantage, to use an economic term, was. But I should say I've stayed out of my father's part of economics. I have not done macro, which is where he really made his major contribution. Actually, I've ended up in the field that was pioneered by my mother's brother, Aaron Director, economic analysis of law. But since outside of that field, he's much less famous, that was less of a problem.
Were your parents happy when you returned to the family business, or disappointed?
You'd have to ask them. Though on the subject of the family business, I wrote a price theory textbook a long time ago, and when I gave them a copy, I inscribed it to the authors from their loving intermediate good.
Very good. David, your most widely read book is probably The Machinery of Freedom, which I first read maybe 30 years ago. And, at the time it struck me as being wildly impractical and utopian. I read it very recently, the update on the plane out to California where I met you last week, and I was struck by how much less crazy it sounded given the mess we've made with the status quo. Are average Americans really ready for the kind of unbridled freedom you preach?
I think the answer is that average Americans would function just fine in the kind of society I describe if that was the society they had grown up in. I think you have to allow for the fact that almost everybody is conservative in the literal sense of the term, that everybody takes for granted the institutions he's familiar with. And one way you can see it is that non-economists routinely overestimate how hard it is for a society to adjust. So that people say if gasoline gets more expensive, terrible things will happen. It's true of all sorts of things. Whereas economists say, no, if the price of this goes up, people will substitute in various ways. They will change their pattern of where they live and how much carpooling they do and what kind of cars they get, and they will adjust to that change. And so similarly, politically, there's a short story by Werner Vinge, who's a moderately successful science fiction author.
One of my favorites.
As well as a computer science professor, which is called The Ungoverned. And it's a short story set in a society which is explicitly based, he's got a note at the end, on my book. And the neat thing about it is that he's looking at it as a writer, as the society these people all take for granted.
They grew up with freedom.
And there's a contrast between that and an adjacent statist society that's invading it, and those people take their institutions for granted. So I don't think it's that people would find it difficult to live in the society I describe. It's just that
how do you get there
getting from here to there is a long, slow process.
In your book, you state that one of the most effective political slogans of recent decades is a verbal error, and that's confusing rights to property with rights of property. What did you mean by that? The
phrase that at least used to be popular was property rights versus human rights. And that makes it sound as though a property right is a right that belongs to property and a human right is a right that belongs to humans. But of course, property rights are rights that belong to humans. So that if you take my stuff away from me, you have violated a human right, namely my property right in owning my stuff, assuming I didn't steal it. So in that sense, it seemed to me that it was just a rhetorical trick to make it sound as though somehow property rights were less important because they had to do with property. And, the food you eat is property, the house you live in is property, the clothes you wear are property. If you have no property rights at all, then somebody can starve you to death, drive you out of your house, strip you naked in the cold, and you freeze to death.
Well, the trick seems to be working. I mean, property rights certainly are declining in the United States.
That's probably the case. I'm a little reluctant to endorse any statements about sort of overall effects because the world is always changing in different directions at once, and it's sort of getting better in some ways and worse in others. That I think the belief that capitalism doesn't work and you need central planning has become much less prevalent over my lifetime.
Certainly globally.
Globally, and I think even locally. It's true that there are a few ideological monocultures, such as most of the elite liberal arts colleges, where people still manage to believe in those things. But I think in the world as a whole, they don't. At the same time, environmentalism has sort of risen as a new basis for making arguments for the same things that used to be argued for on grounds of socialism.
Absolutely.
That one of the things that strikes me, again, in the climate arguments is that there's a cartoon which is very popular with people who think we should do drastic things to avoid warming, and the cartoon says, what if global warming turned out to be a fraud, and then lists all sorts of good things from their standpoint that we'd be doing to prevent it. And it never occurs to the people who put up that cartoon that for anybody who doesn't already agree that these are all good things, this is a reason not to believe them on global warming. Because what the cartoon is saying is global warming provides an argument for things we already wanted to do.
Right, like take over the world economy. I mean, it's a bundling argument. So, David, the system you promote in its full glory is probably most accurately called anarcho-capitalism. Let's dig into some of its tenets, and let me start with the usual objection, which I'm sure you've dealt with 1,000 times. Who will build the roads?
Yeah, that's not an interesting objection. I'll be glad to deal with it.
Dispense with it.
The hard and interesting problems really go back to the classical liberal trilogy, as it were, of police courts and national defense. That roads can be built privately. They sometimes are built privately. The original Pennsylvania Turnpike, which long predated the automobile, was built privately. The railroads were built privately. Roads are really two separate issues. One of them is long-distance roads, such as throughways, and those can simply be built the same way railroads were built by private firms. The harder problem is local roads, because there, in order for my house to be of any use to me, I've got to get to it. And if you're starting with a blank slate, that means that whatever developer sets up a development, part of what you're buying is the right of access, some agreement to pay some amount, the same way that condominiums and similar arrangements are worked now. But you'd obviously have some work to do if you were trying to transition to a fully private society starting here, because you'd somehow have to arrange it in such a way that people had the relevant rights. But I think, from my standpoint, police and courts are what interest me most, and I think are a less hard problem than people assume. And national defense, I think, is a hard problem, although I think there may be solutions. But what I sketch in machinery is a system where every individual is the customer of a firm, and there would presumably be many such firms, which sells him the service of protecting his rights and settling his disputes with other people. That raises the obvious question of, what if I think you've committed a crime against me and you claim you haven't? We have different rights enforcement agencies. So my rights enforcement agency says to you, we think you've stolen Friedman's television, give it back. And if you don't, we'll come and take it away. And you say, I've called up my rights enforcement agency and they'll protect me. And the response to that is that fighting each other is costly. Fighting each other means you're not sure whether or not you'll get your rights protected. It makes much more sense for both of the agencies to agree on arbitration. And then, since they know this problem will occur again, it makes sense for any pair of agencies whose customers will interact to agree in advance on a private court that will settle their dispute.
Well, David, if I take your statement as an analogy for the nation states, how come we have wars if it's so costly to conduct them? Why don't they just go to an arbitrator?
Yes, well, of course, most of the time we don't. If you look at it, most countries most of the time are in fact at peace. But beyond that, a government is not selling a product to willing customers. You don't have the option, at least at low cost, of switching to another government if you don't want to pay for the war. So I have a little scenario in machinery, which actually morphs over into an idea of my son Patrice, who you'll be interviewing later. And the scenario is to imagine the world as it is, except people are perfectly mobile, so that everybody lives in a house trailer. You can easily move from one place to another. And one day, it's announced on the news that it looks as though France and Germany are going into a war. And the next morning, the sun rises on an empty landscape, because everybody who lives in France and Germany, except for the war reporters and the generals, has left, and there's nobody to fight.
Wouldn't that be nice?
So the basic argument is that in the market context, firms have a much stronger incentive to provide what their customers want than in the political context, where they have, in effect, a captive market.
Well, let's get back to this commercial arbitration idea. When you first proposed those theories 30-odd years ago, it was a rarity. Now commercial arbitration is a huge business, is it not?
It is now, but I think it was pretty substantial then. One of my students actually did a paper on arbitration as part of my course on legal systems very different. And the situation at the present, as I understand it, is that many but not all countries are parties to a treaty agreement, which basically says that if two firms in different countries agree to have their disputes arbitrated, the verdict will be enforced by the local courts. But some countries are not party to that. And there are various historical examples where you had private arbitration with no government enforcement and nonetheless worked. What basically makes it work is what economists sometimes refer to as the discipline of constant dealings. The fact that if having access to arbitration is valuable to you, you know that if you agree to arbitration and then back out when you lose the case,
Right.
nobody else will agree to arbitrate with you again.
Or even do business with you.
And that makes it expensive to do business. So just as in my hypothetical anarchist society, what enforces the agreement between the rights enforcement agencies to accept a court is, again, the fact that they know they're repeat players, and if I refuse to accept the verdict when it goes against my customer, you won't accept it when it goes against yours, and we're back shooting at each other, and then we go out of business. So that's the basic logic. One of the things I should say that I've learned in recent years as a result of doing research into a lot of different legal systems, historical and some of them current, is that in some ways the system in Machinery of Freedom was less original than I thought it was, because it's really a modern society version of what is possibly the oldest legal system, namely a decentralized system, what I refer to as feud law.
Feud as in fight.
In which the basic logic is, if you wrong me, I threaten to harm you unless you compensate. And if it works, just as if a modern system works, you don't actually have the fighting happening. The fighting is just the threat that enforces the verdicts. And I did research a long time ago on one such system, which I'm now have more information on and I'm looking at again, but I've discovered a number of others, and it looks as though there are certain conditions you need to meet in order for a feud system to work, but it looks to me as though many existing legal systems were built on top of pre-existing feud systems.
David, let's touch on a few more topics you cover in your book. When you first preached the privatization of the airways by the FCC way back when, many thought you were kooky. Now it's business as usual. Are you pleased with how the spectrum auction policy worked out?
Well, it's better. I should say it wasn't originally my idea. This was an idea proposed by Ronald Coase, who was a very important and interesting and unconventional economist long before I proposed it. And certainly when he proposed it, everybody thought it was obviously crazy. But in fact, they haven't gone all the way because they are still, in effect, deciding what a particular part of the spectrum should be used for, but then auctioning it off as to who gets to use it.
Right.
And a full-blown version would be one in which the cell phone companies could, in effect, bid against the television stations for bandwidth, and we would find out who it was worth more to.
Yeah.
But they've certainly gone a good deal of the way in that direction, and I think that's an improvement, that one very rarely gets everything one wants.
The Cold War is over, the communists lost, but the ideological battle continues. How is the struggle going between creeping socialism and creeping capitalism?
We won the largest battle in that war that has ever happened. China is no longer a socialist society.
Billion people.
China is certainly not as capitalist as I'd like it to be. It maybe is a little less capitalist than the U.S., although that's a little hard to judge because it's more in some ways and less in others. My conclusion after spending some time in Shanghai and talking with people was that Shanghai, at least, was less capitalist in theory and more in practice. But compared to what it was, it's a pretty striking case. I think people don't appreciate just how striking it was. I've been working on an article coming out of Ronald Coase's last book, which was about the Chinese transition to capitalism. And between Mao's death and 2010, the per capita GNP of China went up 20-fold.
Wow.
And that's whatever it is, a quarter of the population of the world or a fifth of the population of the world.
Pretty
who
convincing.
have suddenly gone from being desperately poor to being still a good deal poorer than we are, but enormously better off than they were. When Mao died, The Economist had a obituary which credited him with ending starvation in China. We now know that during the Great Leap Forward, between 30 and 40 million people starved to death.
Yeah.
And that was the contrast between the image and the reality. So I think in that sense, I think the good guys are winning, so to speak. And I have to say I'm favorably impressed by how little traction global warming has actually gotten in U.S. policy. That the people who are sure it's obvious that we should do drastic things about it keep wringing their hands, but they so far have not succeeded. And I think there are reasons why they have not succeeded.
So, David, getting ready for our next guest in the second half of the show, how did your ideas influence your son, Patry?
It's It's an interesting question. I didn't really bring him up. His mother and I separated a little while after he was born. So although I certainly saw as much of him as I could when he was little, and when he was older, he spent summers with me and my second wife, I can't say that I directly controlled his growing up. One anecdote that may be relevant was a conversation we had when he was spending the summer with us at some point. And he said something, I no longer remember what it was, and either I or my wife asked him what was his reason for believing. And he said, well, it's just my opinion. And we made it clear that we didn't think that was satisfactory. If it was, if he formed opinions with no reason, why should anybody be interested in them? And his response was that his other parents didn't insist that if he expressed an opinion, he had to have a reason for it. And so one of us, I think probably my wife, though it might have been me, asked him whether when we said something, when we told him you should do this or should do that, we were willing to defend that, whether we said, do it because we tell you to, or whether we took the position that if he had a good argument against what we're doing, we would accept that argument. And he agreed that we took the latter position, and that his other parents didn't. And we asked him which he preferred, a world where both we and he were required to give reasons for what we said, or a world in which neither of us were. And I think he chose the same world that we chose.
And that's apparent by his career course, which we'll find out about shortly. On that, David, let me thank you for being on the show and wish you a happy Father's Day.
Thank you. And I wish you a happy Father's Day as well. Bye-bye.
That was David Friedman from Santa Clara Law School, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, David's son Patry takes us through the next chapter in his grandfather Milton Friedman's Legacy of Liberty. Stay tuned.